a lot of us have heard how he discovered the manuscript of his father's in a desk drawer some years after he died. And so I wanted to kind of explore how that came to be and what he thought of it when he found it.
Right. So I guess I'll probably back up a little bit because I'm not sure how much people know. It's always a big question mark. This crowd may be very familiar with Tuesdays with Morrie. A lot of people who are, let's say, under 40 have no idea what Tuesdays with Morrie is, which is a shock to me, but that's okay. So, of course, Tuesdays with Morrie was a huge hit and developed my father's reputation publicly, but of course, he never lived to see any of that, right? My father got ill in 1994, very ill in 1995, and he appeared on Nightline with Ted Koppel 3 times, and because of that show, his student from Brandeis University, where he was a professor, Mitch Albom, came back, met him, decided to interview him. They spent a number of Tuesdays talking, and after my father passed away, he published Tuesdays with Morrie, which became this incredible hit, called the biggest selling memoir of all time. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly is an incredible bestseller. But as I said, my father never experienced any of that. He passed away in 1995. So to move the story back to address PK's question, I was living in Japan for a very long time, and I was a journalist in Japan, and I would go back and forth between the United States and Tokyo. And in Boston, where my family lived throughout the whole time that I was with them, from when I was born until I moved to Japan and thereafter, I would work on my pieces, on my articles in my father's study after 1995, after he passed away. And I was doing that one day, and I'm not exactly sure the year, 2002, 2003, and I just decided to pull open a desk drawer and see what was in there. My mother had kept my father's study exactly as he had it, with all the books. My father had so many books, more books that are in this room. I'm not joking. More books that are in this room were in my father's study. And his desk was big, and there was still lots of stuff on it. My mother hadn't really thrown away much of his things. So I pulled open the desk drawer, and there was this big, thick, bound manuscript. It wasn't, thin or little thing or loose leaf paper. He actually had bound it with a big black hard top. Of course, I still have it. And so this is one point that I like to make because it corrects a misconception. Some people have commented or seem to think that I put this book together from my father's notes, and that is not true at all. My father wrote this manuscript from the very first page to the very last page. Now, of course, I did a tremendous amount of editing in there, so what you're reading is not exactly what he wrote. I edited it, and we can talk about that, how I edited it and why. So it's somewhat different than what he wrote, but every word in there is his. I didn't add any paragraphs or change anything. I did add 2 essays, one at the beginning, one at the end, which are very clearly my essays and have my name on it. But in terms of my father's writing from the introduction to the end of the book, it's entirely his. So I found this manuscript and I started looking through it, and I realized, wow, now we have a chance to publish this manuscript. It's actually, my father wrote it between 1988 and 1992, and he wasn't able to get it published in 1992. So he just put it in the desk drawer, and the next year he got ill, and it was, I wouldn't say completely forgotten, but largely forgotten. We didn't really talk about it in the family, so it was kind of like a shock to rediscover it. And I actually had a lot of experience talking to my father about this book, because just as chance would have it, moving even more backward in time, I had done a lot of traveling in Asia in the late 80s, just, as a young pup. And I moved back, or traveled back to Boston in 1989, in the summer of 1989. And I lived at home for 3 months before I moved to Japan for a really long residence in Japan. So for those 3 months while I lived at home in Boston, my father was working intensely on this book. So I talked to him about it every day. And I got a sense of, what he was trying to accomplish and what he was struggling with, and we really discussed it very thoroughly. So when I rediscovered it in his desk drawer 15 years later, 13, 14 years later, I really had a good background and a good grasp on what this book was and what it was trying to do. So that's the background of how I found it.
Well, you answered one of the questions I was going to ask about the familiarity.
I'll try not to do that too often.
So you touched on the editing process. I imagine that, you said that he was verbose.
Right.
So you had, how long did it take you to go through the editing process, and what was your mindset in order to maintain, his voice?
Right.
Because it's by him.
Right.
So was that a
Absolutely.
little bit of a struggle?
No, I wouldn't say it's a struggle. So first of all, you hit the nail on the head. My most important aim in editing this book was to maintain my father's voice, because he has a very distinctive voice. You can hear it in Tuesdays with MORRIE, which is a much slimmer volume than this. You can hear it very strongly in this book. So that was my number one aim, is not to, lose that. I had to maintain his voice. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, my father was a professor at Brandeis University. He actually wrote a lot of academic work, which we can talk about, and I do talk about in the first essay in the book. So it's not that this book is in any way written in an academic style. It's not. But since he was an academic, they have this sort of expansive view of things. The ideas always seem to expand for them. So a lot of the editing just had to do with focusing what he was saying on the main point and cutting out extraneous things, or he would list things and the list would just get far too long. It's like, you need to leave this aside and concentrate on the main point. So yeah, my father was verbose, or whatever. His writing tended to really expand. So that was one of the main challenges, was to cut out the stuff that was not necessary, make it as readable as possible, but maintain his voice. And just to continue to answer this for a little bit, I edited this book many, many times, not just once.
Sure.
And as I write about in the second essay, I actually had a lot of help from my mother. My mother was, sorry, we can create new questions. My mother was my father's editor for a lot of his academic work, both books that he wrote and articles. So she had a really good feel on his writing style. And she pointed me in the right direction in a lot of cases, though she didn't edit it, but she would say, maybe think about this, think about that. And I write about that in the second essay in the book, which is at the back of the book, if you're interested.
So she was a valued source for
Absolutely,
you.
absolutely, right.
In both suggesting things and pointing you in the right direction. And
That's right,
giving
that's
you
right.
feedback.
And she was a big part of the process, not right towards the end, when I was editing it maybe for the fourth or fifth time, but some of the early edits and some of the whole process, she was heavily involved in.
So on that level, it did take a while to come to fruition. What would you say were the biggest challenges with that?
Right. It took a very long time, as you can tell from the dates that I've given you. There was a lot of things. One thing that is very difficult for me, and I mean I can talk about it when it is difficult, is that it was very hard for me to grieve for my father. We were very, very close. And I would say the first, I don't know even how many, 3, 4, possibly up to 5 years, I didn't even really grieve for him, in the correct way. And it took a lot, because it was, even though, he was ill and we had a long period where we knew he was going to die, that it was a terminal illness, it was still a tremendous shock for me, for him not to be with us. So editing this book was also, for me, involved with grieving for my father. So it took a really long time to come to terms with that and be able to edit it properly. And as I said, I also edited it many, many times. So it was a very long process, that's correct.
Would you say it was therapeutic?
I would say it's therapeutic, yeah.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about the actual book and the advice
Sure.
that your dad
Sure.
had to live a more vibrant and creative.
Right. Well, that is the subtitle. living more vibrantly and joyously. So in addition to sort of analyzing what ageism is and how poisonous ageism is, and we can talk about that as well, my father actually wanted to give people like straight ahead advice that you can implement into your life to make it more joyous and more creative. So he has a whole list of things that come through in many of these chapters if you read the book. So on the one hand, he has like specific things. For example, he thought that as people age, somehow the humor seems to go out of their life. He thought that laughter was extremely important. So he urges people to pursue what makes you laugh, what you find humorous, and make sure that you get your fill of that in your life. He really hadn't found anybody else discussing that or thinking about that. On the other hand, something that's very, very different, but also a practical everyday technique, is that my father thought that meditation was extremely important to calm yourself down, to focus your mind, to sort of remain in a very calm state of being. And I'm not sure exactly when the study was done. There were some studies done a long time ago, but one fairly recently done over a large number of seniors showed that seniors that meditate live on average 5 years longer than seniors who don't meditate. That's a pretty stunning statistic. So I think that the evidence actually shows that meditation is an incredibly powerful tool. So those are kind of things that are sort of everyday things you can implement into your life. He also had sort of broader ideas as well, some of which will sound very familiar to people who've read Tuesdays with MORRIE. So he felt that the most important thing in everybody's life is your relationships with your friends and your family, the people who are important to you. Like everything else towards the end of your life is going to fall away. One of my father's sort of famous sayings is that the end of your life, on your deathbed, the size of your bank account is not going to matter at all. But all of the times that you shared with your friends and your family and people who are important to you, that's what's going to matter. So, this is coming from somebody who was at the end of his life. So because he had that philosophy and that value, and it didn't just spring up during the last year or two of his life. It's also very present in this book. He's saying, pay attention to your relationships, value them, take care with them. If you are, fighting with somebody, work it out. Whatever it is, it's not as important as the relationship itself and enjoying spending time with that person. So that's sort of a larger thing. And more specifically, my father says that aging people sometimes sort of withdraw from life. And he talks about this whole from a psychological perspective, which we can discuss. But he says this is really a thing that stops people from living joyously and creatively. So figure out what interests you and pursue that, however you can pursue it. If it's something that you can join groups or study about, pursue it and learn more about it. And in addition to learning more, that will open you up to making new friends, to meeting new people, and therefore developing new relationships, expanding, the limits of the relationships you had before. So these things all sort of work together. And the last one, which is sort of the most difficult to explain and perhaps the most difficult to, it's more, let's put it this way, it's more personal for each person, is that my father felt developing a spiritual connection was really important. But he never explains, what your spiritual connection should be. That's entirely up to you. So if your spiritual connection is through an established religion, that's fine. If it's through something that's much more personal to you or through something that's more alternative, that's fine as well. But he felt that our society has sort of lost any kind of spiritual connection, and that was a big problem. So he encouraged people to develop a spiritual connection in whatever that means for you. So those are some of the things.
Well, do you think that he would be somewhat surprised at the, not just the longevity that we've seen today for people, but I'm about ready to turn the big 60, and I don't feel like that.
Right.
And I don't feel like my friends who are all,
Right.
the same, around the same age. We are a really active bunch.
Absolutely.
We're
Absolutely.
walking, playing pickleball, going skiing,
Absolutely.
socializing, going out to lunch. And I mean, while my mom and dad entertained and did stuff, they weren't involved in a lot of the things that we're involved with. Like, we have meetups,
Right.
we have Facebook groups, we
Right.
have all this stuff. What do you think your dad would think of the way that we're approaching getting older?
Right. Well, I would say, first of all, if you read this book, you can see that my father was very prophetic, particularly on this point. There's so many stories in this book, and if you haven't picked it up, you'll notice it's filled with all sorts of different kinds of writing. It's not just like one narrative. There's stories and quotes and poetry and quotes from articles, long sections from articles, and lots of stories of other people. And most of the stories of other people are seniors and aging people who are doing remarkable things at a very advanced age. So this is something that he was pointing towards back in 1989, 1990, and it's something that we see today. People who are, much older than it used to be the norm for in public life, doing things 80, 85, 90. I know a researcher for ALS, actually, which we can talk about as well, who's 90 years old, not showing any chance of slowing down. I know another researcher who's a cancer researcher. I think he's 86 or 87. These people are still plowing. My mother was, in addition to everything else she did, she was a licensed psychoanalyst, a therapist. She worked until she was 91.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I think that my father would absolutely encourage it, and it's exactly what he's talking about in the book, is living a vibrant, creative life. There's no reason to think that as you get older, you need to sit in the corner and just, watch TV or whatever. He's absolutely encouraging people to be as active and involved with the world as they can possibly be.
Along those lines, I want to read something from the book and ask you about that.
Sure.
On page 51, his dad writes, "There is so much social, political, and economic dysfunction and abuse in our society that you can easily find a way to pitch in. For example, you might find it gratifying to be an adopted grandparent for a child who has none, or a tutor for an underprivileged child. You can join a group that opposes nuclear testing, or join a political club to work for a candidate or party you would like to see elected." So since this talking about being prophetic, but talking about something that, he wrote this 30 years ago, I would just ask, what would MORRIE think of the society that we live in now and the current climate that
Sure,
we deal with
sure.
every day?
Sure. Yeah, I think that he would be extremely disappointed and, quite disturbed by the society that we have now on two fronts. Without, taking any one particular position, I think the two things that would disturb him is, one is social media, which is so ironic, right? It's so paradoxical that social media connects us. We have this incredible ability to communicate with anybody in the world instantaneously, yet the overall effect is that it separates us, is that we spend our time staring at our phone or staring at a screen and not talking to the person sitting next to it. Extremely ironic, but I think he would be very disturbed by that, and he would also be disturbed by the division in our society. It's like, we just live in two different worlds now, and this is a really, really big problem. And we've got to find a way to bridge those two worlds and create some common ground. And, I'm not saying I have the answer for that, but that is how my father would feel about it, for
Yeah.
sure.
All right. We already talked about your mom's contribution to the project. Do you want to elaborate on that?
No, I think we covered it. My mother was crucial to this, and my mother was the one that held the family together after my father passed away. She was also, I will say a couple things about my mother. My mother was obviously the thing that held the family together while my father was ill in 1995, and Mitch was coming every week. And Mitch talks about it a little bit, but she was also a very private person. So she intentionally kept herself out of Mitch's book, for example. There was a movie that was made from the book a couple of years later, which Oprah was a producer on. She kept herself out of that. So she intentionally avoided the limelight, but she was the the matriarch of our family and kept everything together. And for example, there was a lots of materials that she kept that were helpful for me in this book. My dad's papers, letters, things that were written to him and about him. We have a whole stack of letters that people wrote to him while he was ill. So those were really valuable in me editing this book, and that's all due to her.
Okay. So you have called Tuesdays with Morrie and the Wisdom of Morrie bookends.
Right.
Why is that?
Right. Well, in some ways you can look at them and think that they're very different books. But if you read them and you really absorb the content, you realize that the thrust of what they're saying is very similar. So Tuesdays with Morrie is a very slim volume. Mitch writes very economically on purpose. There's no doubt that he wrote this so that everybody could read it immediately without having to use a dictionary, just very, very quickly. And my father's book is much more in-depth, much more analytical, because that's who my father was, talking about issues that aging people face in a really deep way, talking about the problems in our society around aging, and a term that he created, by the way, called age casting, which comes from the term typecasting, which is basically just trying to put seniors into a box and say, this is your role now that you're past 70 or whatever it is, this is your role. You don't do anything else, just this. And we know that to typecast an actor is a terrible thing. To typecast a person or to age cast a person is a terrible thing too. It limits what people expect them to be able to do, which is ridiculous. People have such unlimited potential. Sorry. What was the bookends? The bookends, yeah. Right. Thank you. Got lost there for a second. So the ideas in Tuesday with Morrie and the ideas in this book, some of which I've already outlined, are very similar in terms of what is valuable in your life. My father in Tuesdays with Morrie is generally talking about what's valuable in life, right? And what is a lot of hype, and in the end of your life you realize is not valuable. And basically the same things come through in this book, whether it's your relationships with people, whether it's developing a spiritual connection. I think that you can see the same themes in both of the books, which is why they are bookends.
What do you think is the demographic for this book?
Well, clearly my father wrote it with, seniors in mind, people, let's say, over 65. But I think there's so much great advice in there that it could be useful for people of any age. And people in their 20s and 30s have read this book and have told me that they got a tremendous amount out of it. So I think it could really be useful for people of any age, especially the advice that I laid out, the sort of, point by point. I think young people often forget that it's your relationships with other people that's going to give your life meaning. And, your career is great and earning a lot of money is great, but only as an end, only as a means to the end of enjoying the time with the people who you really care about.
So not only would I direct this next question to you about your own personal views about aging, have you talked to many others about their feelings on aging, and those who have read the book versus those who have not?
It's a little hard for me to compare those who have read it versus those who have not, because basically I've talked to people who are interested in the book who have read it. But I think it's a little bit funny for me because, I grew up with my dad, and he was a very gregarious person. He loved to talk, and he was a teacher. That's another thing that comes through both Tuesdays with Morrie, and there was an article written by a guy in the Boston Globe that kickstarted the whole Tuesdays with Morrie thing that the producer of Nightline found, and that's why he brought my father onto Nightline. And in that article, the headline is a teacher until the end. And that was my father's attitude, that I'm a teacher, I need to sort of help people along the path. So as his son, I feel like I absorbed this kind of stuff along the way. It wasn't like a revelation for me to read it and go oh wow, that's how I should lead my life. I felt like that was the way I was already living my life. So it was nice to see it reaffirmed, but I felt like it was something that I had integrated already into my life.
So you said that you came across other things that your mom had saved, like letters from when he was ill. Any chance you're gonna publish a volume 2 and include additional stuff?
I don't think it would be volume 2, and I don't think I would publish those letters because those were personal things that were written to my father. But I have thought about for a long time writing something about my dad, because Tuesdays with MORRIE is such a slim volume and gives basically a picture of him as an older, ill person. But of course, I knew this guy who was, really energetic, really vibrant with life. And there's so many great stories about him. I remember some. My brother has some. I've already interviewed a lot of my father's colleagues and friends throughout his life. I actually started doing this a long time ago, about 2006 or 2007. I started interviewing people. So I have a lot of stories about my dad, and I'm thinking, yes, I'll collect them.
I think he's gonna write another book.
Probably, if you guys can help this book along, and we can get it to a place where I feel there's people who want to read more about my father. Yeah, but I certainly have thought about it and sort of planned it. And in fact, I had these two ideas: me writing a book about my dad, and my dad's book, which is this book right here before us. And I thought, which should I publish first? And initially I thought, well, I'll publish my book because it's more personal and stories about him. But then I thought, that's ridiculous. My father wrote a book. Obviously, that's the one that we should publish first. So here it is. But yeah, if the response is strong enough, I certainly will do it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for doing the interview. And we'll open the floor and see if anybody has any questions out there.
Ask anything. It can be about Tuesdays with MORRIE if you like, because that was such a warmly received book. Yes?
Do you have any idea, and if so, would you be willing to share what you think your dad may have considered as a title?
That's a good question.
You're going to catch me out a little bit here because there's not considered, he had a title on the book.
Right.
And we didn't use it because it was something that, first of all, his name wouldn't have been on it because he wasn't famous at that point. He wasn't well known. So I can't tell you exactly what that title was, but it was something like Enjoying Your Aging or something along those lines.
Walk it out.
Yes.
Do you follow your dad's advice in terms of do you meditate? Are you spiritual?
Yes, absolutely. I do meditate, and I spent a long time in Asia, living in Tokyo and traveling in other Asian countries. I've built my own little spiritual viewpoint, pulling things from a lot of Eastern philosophies, Buddhism and Hinduism particularly. And I talked to my father a lot about it. And, as a child of somebody like this, you always wonder how deeply was I influenced from my dad. I wouldn't say that he considered himself a Buddhist, but he had a lot of books on Buddhism. And we could also talk about my father's life and how all of those things came together. In some ways, his character was really formed by the 60s when all of these new ideas were springing up, even though he wasn't that young. He wasn't the demographic, but he read widely across Eastern thought, and I sort of absorbed that.
Anyone else?
Okay, how old your father was when he died?
My father was 78 when he died, and he was 76. Hold on, let me get it right. Born in 16. So he was 77 when he got ill with ALS, which is very unusual, right? I don't know if people here know much about ALS as a disease, but generally it strikes people from 30 to 50, and not so much afterwards. And my father developed it at 77, which was really unusual, and that's just what happened. But so he developed it at 77, and he passed away at 78. In fact, the doctor, when we got the ALS diagnosis, which Mitch, by the way, has a little bit wrong in Tuesdays with MORRIE, but that's okay. He has the story a little bit wrong, but he wasn't there, so the doctor actually came to our house to give my father the diagnosis, and he said, you have between 12 and 18 months. and my father lived 16 months. It was like
Wow.
exactly accurate diagnosis. And a little bit of progress has been made with treatment for ALS, but not that much. So it's a very, very difficult disease. And just to add one thing to your question, so he was 78 when he died. He was 72 when he started writing this book.
And it took him how long?
He wrote it for about 4 years. Yeah. Until he started to get ill, basically.
So, but he had actually completed it. It wasn't like you had.
Completed it, yeah, and had it typed. My father didn't type. He had paid somebody to
Oh,
type
wow.
it. There's one other thing I want to add, which I haven't really discussed that much, but I think it's interesting. There's kind of, in a way, 2 sections to this book, and it reflects my father's sort of like development about his own aging, because my father always thought of himself as like a young person, even when he was in his 60s or let's say, and at age 70, he was forced to retire his professorship from university, which that doesn't exist anymore. Professors are not forced to retire, but he was. And then all of a sudden it hit him that society looked at him as an elderly person. He didn't look at himself as an elderly person, but society looked at him as an elderly person. And he had to examine and think about what that meant. And he was sort of aghast to find, and it's in the book there, you can read it, that not only did society have all these ageist ideas about what aging people could and couldn't do, he himself had internalized all of these ideas, which he then came to realize were so wrong about what it means to be elderly or what you're able to do or what you're not able to do. So part of the book is about saying, like, you got to get rid of these ideas that, you know, seniors can't do this or can't do that or don't have this available to him. And that's where he talks about ageism and, as I mentioned earlier, age casting. And then after that, he goes on to give people direct advice, some of which I mentioned, to try and make their life more vibrant and more creative, which certainly he was employing in his own life. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit more about your father's upbringing, what shaped his mentality
Sure.
and his interests?
Sure. Part of this also is in Tuesdays with MORRIE, if you're interested. But so actually, my father grew up very poor in the Jewish ghetto in New York, had a very difficult childhood. And one of the reasons he had a very difficult childhood, not only were they poor, but his mother passed away when he was 8 years old. And obviously, this is a huge trauma for a young boy. And he ascribed this experience as the reason that he is so sensitive to the suffering of other people and so has so much empathy for people around him, and kind of informed his whole life, both his academic career, which was a social psychologist about mental illness, and his personal lives, where he, developed all of these wonderful friendships, and some of it is talked about in Tuesdays with MORRIE. So he grew up poor and also had this big tragedy in his life. And it's discussed in Tuesdays with MORRIE. It's discussed in detail in this book. He talks about how he was in his 50s when he finally dealt with this trauma and was able to release the trauma that he felt so deeply. It took him that long, into his 50s. And he writes a lot and deeply about the experience of finally coming to terms with it. You hear somebody had something over here? Another question?
Yeah, so where he says to develop a spiritual practice, I grew up in your same neighborhood in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
In Brookline?
Yeah.
You grew up in Brookline?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Where? You as well? Wow. 2 Brookline transplants. So my hometown is Brookline. I write it in the essay of the book. I live nearby, but not in Brookline, but that's crazy. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
my question, if you're willing to share, is I found that the temples there were lacking. Did your family belong to one, or which one?
Yeah, so my father grew up religious and was bar mitzvah and all of that, but when he became an academic, he really left traditional Judaism behind. We did not go to temple We celebrated some of the holidays, more of the social ones. You know, Hanukkah, Pesach, we had Passover, but we never like went to temple on a regular basis. So we were not involved with the temples. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
So you talked about your father releasing like when he was 50 years old of this trauma or whatever. Did you go into that process of what that actually was?
In this book, he does. He talks about it. I mean, I can talk about it a little bit. It's probably easier for you just to read it. So my father he did a lot of things in his life, and he was very involved with trying to help people in a lot of different ways. And he was also very politically active and trying to help people less fortunate economically. And these two things came together in the 70s. He co-founded what they called a personal growth center, which was basically a center for therapy. And they did a lot of group therapy. It was called Greenhouse. It was based in Central Square in Cambridge for the homies here who know Boston. And he actually founded it with someone who was quite famous at the time, a guy named Phil Slater, who had written a book called The Pursuit of Loneliness, which was a critique of American life and basically some of the themes that we're talking about here, how people are making themselves lonelier and lonelier by pursuing wealth and success at the cost of their personal life and their relationships. So pretty similar themes. So they created this collective called Greenhouse, and they offered low-cost / free mental health care. If you couldn't afford to pay anything, you could come in and get treatment and interact with people for no cost whatsoever. And my father, they also were giving therapy to each other. So in this Greenhouse environment, he had therapy, which he writes about in the book, where he ended up crying for like 24 straight hours or something like that. You can read the story in the book, but it's extremely powerful. But that is, those details are in the book. And he certainly talked about it with the family. Like, it wasn't like I didn't know about these things. So, and he had actually, just to let you know, been in therapy before that, back in the 50s when they called it analysis. He'd been in analysis with a quite famous therapist in the Washington, D.C. area. But that was 25 years before he had this experience in Greenhouse.
Did he have a close relationship with his dad?
Nobody's ever asked that question. So I have
Can you
lot.
repeat the question?
The question is my father's relationship with his father, my grandfather.
How was that? Was
Yeah.
that close?
Yeah. He didn't talk about it very much, but as it happens, I have a lot of videotape that I shot of my father while he was ill, talking to people in groups, talking to people one-on-one, because we knew that he wasn't going to be with us. So I set up a video camera and I shot a lot of videotape with him. And in fact, Mitch used some of the videotape and used it with MORRIE to write some of that book. And I have videotape of him talking about his father, and it's rather sad. Like, his father did not have a real close relationship. His father was not an intellectual. He was a very simple man. My father tells the story of like his father just used to sit under a lamppost and read a Yiddish newspaper, because he couldn't even read English, my grandfather, and sort of wander the streets of New York. That's what he liked to do. So they did not have a really close relationship. And I barely knew him. Of course, he passed away when I was young, but he rarely came to visit us. We were in Boston. He lived his whole life in New York after he immigrated. My grandfather immigrated to this country.
Was there another mother or father figure in his life?
Wow, you're really hitting the spots here. So after his mother passed away at age 8, my father and uncle, who was about 6 years younger than them, had the unbelievable luck of my grandfather marrying a second wife, who was this wonderful woman, Ava, who took care of them. So my uncle actually didn't even know for a long time that Ava was not his mother.
Wow.
That his biological mother had passed away when he was like 1 or 2, something like that. But this wonderful woman came into their lives and cared for them, and so he was able to, grow up with a relatively happy childhood. Yeah, that's correct.
Nice.
I may have missed this, but did your father go to therapy to deal with his grief, or was it just through his own thoughts that he worked through his grief?
Okay, well, I mentioned it, but we'll go over it once again. So my father was in therapy twice. Once in the 1950s, when it wasn't really very popular and they called it analysis. He had a very well-known psychoanalytic therapist in Washington, D.C. Edith Vibert was her name, if you're interested. She was very well known at the time, and it was a woman, so that was interesting. And then in the 70s, they had this mental health collective called Greenhouse, which they were treating people, but also treating themselves. And in this book, there's a whole episode of him dealing with the trauma around his mother, which was super intense for him. And he writes about it in great detail in The Wisdom of MORRIE.
Yeah, my mother died when I was a teenager, and I've never been to therapy at all, but
Yeah.
I think I would go.
Yeah, I mean, it's traumatic for sure. And
Or just read the book.
yeah, but I think that, no, I mean, the book could help, but therapy could also help. Yeah. I have a feeling that we went over.
Did we?
Are we over, or no, we're doing okay? Well, great. If there are any more questions, feel free.
What do you think your dad would think about today's 70-year-old people, since he was kicked out at 70? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think we addressed this earlier, but absolutely, he would be very, very encouraged by how active people, who are over 70 are today, which was, very much in contradistinction to how people were in the 90s and the 70s and the 50s. And, my father was born in 1916. So he came from a different world where, people who died younger, but also, seniors just didn't continue to live a really active, vibrant life at that time. So I think he would be very encouraged by how active and engaged with life the people who are, let's say, over 70 are. And also the fact that you're not forced to retire at 70. He was forced to retire. We had a very good friend who was a younger colleague of my father's. My father was in the sociology department at Brandeis, and he had a younger colleague who was also very involved with a lot of the similar things that he was involved in, named Gordy Feldman. And Gordy continued to teach until he was 88.
What did your dad do actively, or was he mostly cerebral after the fact, or was he, did he go outside, did he walk a lot, did he do push-ups?
Yeah, absolutely. I can answer those questions. I think it's a good question, actually. So he, first of all, he was very involved with physical activity. His big exercise was swimming. He swam practically every day. So there was 3 or 4 things that I would outline that he did that I feel are very active, some of which involve sitting in a chair, like meditation. But his big thing, and this is something that sort of kicked off the whole Tuesdays with MORRIE phenomenon, was talking to people. So while he was at Brandeis, he traveled the country and he gave lectures on certain subjects for the general public, not for academics, which, though he wasn't famous, it was organized through Brandeis. So it was, so he loved to do that. And then when he got ill, I think if you've read the book, he sort of organized groups to talk about death and to talk about politics and to talk about grieving. And so that was his thing, to talk to people. But he also was very involved with physical exercise and meditation. So those are the sort of 3 things that I would point to that he kept very active. And then, of course, he had a huge set of friends, which he met all the time and discussed and went out and did things. It's in this book, and I think it's also in Tuesdays with MORRIE. It's certainly in the movie. Until he was no longer able to, he went to a group which the 2 Bostonians may have heard of called Dance Free, which was a group that just danced in a very free way to all kinds of different music. It took place in a church in Harvard Square. And, he loved to dance. And that's something that's part of the book, part of the movie. It doesn't talk about dance so much in this book, but that's something that's sort of well-known part of his biography.
Today's Zumba.
Could be. He might be into that. Yes.
You seem to offer perhaps a qualified critique about social media.
Yeah.
How would your father or you see social media today for people of our age? Because you talk about relationships as we get older and how important it is.
Yes.
And you talked about going to events and seeing people and doing things. How would you see social media playing into that?
Right. I mean, this is my opinion. Whether my father would have the exact same opinion, I can't say because it didn't exist while he was alive. But I don't think social media is bad or, something that we need to erase from our lives. It's just a matter of keeping it in perspective. People get consumed by social media. They spend their whole day staring at a little screen, It's fine to text with people, to do other social media, Facebook or what have you. But if you notice that it's eating into your time, your real live face-to-face time with your friends and your family, then perhaps you should cut it back. If you keep it in its proper place, it's a wonderful thing to be able to communicate with people all over the world. But it's just become this monster that's eaten everything else around it. So if you can keep it in its proper place as a nice little pet that we use and that serves us as opposed to us serving it, then I think it's fine.
To answer that a little bit further, I think that it can be really helpful for people in order to stay connected to their families that don't live locally. And I have a friend of mine that has a Zoom call every Sunday with her family that, they may live across the country or wherever, or you may be able to have like a private, page that you post the grandkids pictures or their, you could even live stream their soccer game or whatever. There are definitely positives
That's great.
for it,
Yeah.
but I agree, it's like this all-time consumption is what sends people over the edge.
Well, I think technology, as you're talking about, we did not have that,
Right.
with our parents or grandparents. It offers the possibility, and I do that quite often with FaceTime
Yeah,
or Zoom calls with family and people that I've not seen physically, have seen.
right.
But I also have an observation that you can narrow your community if you're involved in social media.
Sure.
It should be intended to expand your community
Right.
and the diversity of your opinion and the people you see, but it seems to have a somewhat adverse effect of narrowing
Right.
your thoughts and the people you deal with.
Yeah,
That's just
because
an
you want
opinion.
to like
Just an opinion.
I agree with you because I think we tend to like, be attracted to the people who agree with us or,
Right.
and you want to hear what you believe in.
Right. And,
Oh,
and
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I don't want to get too deep on it.
No, this concept has come up in
Yeah.
news a lot, right?
Yeah.
Called the echo chamber, right?
Right.
You only hear what you already believe, and that is definitely a problem. That is definitely a problem. Yeah. But as PK said, I mean, during the pandemic, I was in Japan. We had Zoom every week with my brother and my mother and, family members, and it was fantastic. So it's not a bad thing in its proper place.
Right. My mother used to always say, everything with moderation,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
In
It's
moderation.
also a Buddhist idea.
There you go.
All right, I think if there's no more questions, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's not even, I know, I'm joking.
Hi, David.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to
we
meet
live in
you.